Chapter 1. Saskia. It was a good day to rob people. The streets of Baskin were alive that morning, just the way Saskia liked them. You could judge the mood of the place the moment you stepped out the door. Sometimes the city felt mellow and content. At others, it was like holding its breath. That was a bad atmosphere to work in. People were already on the alert, waiting for a sign of trouble, and Saskia would have to go for simple, low-risk marks in murky neighborhoods. Days like today, however, when the streets all the way down to the River Hask percolated with activity, were ripe with opportunity. It made training the latest Thieves Guild recruits that much easier. "Derry, you're up first." Saskia gestured to the wiry 10-year-old, who stood to attention as soon as she said his name. The street corner they were on was loaded up with discarded boxes from the nearby grocer, making it an inconspicuous place to loiter. She crouched down among the debris of dirty paper and stained packing material, so she was closer to him. His growth spurt hadn't come yet, and at 19, Saskia was significantly taller than him. She scanned the road in front of them at his eye level. "So, what do you see?" she asked. Kieran, shorter still than Derry, a little slip of an 8-year-old, also peered over Derry's elbow, staring hard into the crowds shifting through the street while taking a disproportionately large bite out of a jam tart. "Where'd you get that?" Saskia asked. Kieran looked down at the pastry, as if he hadn't noticed it was in his hand. "Oh, over there." He waved the tart vaguely at a cart trundling down the road, stacked with baskets of baked goods. Saskia shook her head, bemused. Kieran had a natural talent for this work, but only where desserts were concerned. "No more stealing until I say so. If we're taking something today, it's gonna be shiny and metal, or you'll have Grecius to answer to." They had quotas they were expected to fill. Their leader wasn't unreasonable in what he asked of them, but he was definitely accustomed to his orders being followed. The two boys and Clemmy, the third of Saskia's students that morning, nodded. She resumed the lesson, addressing Derry. "Go on, what do you see?" The street was a typical retail hub in the city, but that was the point. It was important her students learned what they were meant to be looking for in the innocuous settings that made up their hunting grounds. "There's shops with displays," Derry said, "and customers, lots of servants. I can tell from their uniforms, shopping for their masters probably, so they'll be carrying more decent coin than the average human. There's a few elves too." That was all normal. The street was hardly grand, but the elves would joke it was good enough for humans on the occasions when, for the sake of cheaper prices and more variety, the elves risked their fine silks and delicate laces by visiting streets edged with grime. "Right, so how does that help us? Who's the better target?" Kieran shot his hand up, his jam tart long gone, the pressure of holding in his answer propelling him into little hops from one foot to the other. Oh, I know. It's not school, Kieran. You can just say it." At 12, Clemmy had a voice like one of the wind instruments elven musicians played on theater balconies, reedy and high. It belied the strength Saskia knew hid beneath. Clemmy wouldn't have made it to the guild if she wasn't a survivor. The streets of Baskin weren't a place where the weak could survive. Kieran obediently dropped his hand and answered. "The elves will be more loaded, 'cause they've got all their own coin, and the servants will only have an allowance from their masters." "Right, but what have we overlooked so far? What do elves have, besides boatloads of money, that us humans don't?" "Magic," whispered Derry, fearfully. "Magic," Saskia repeated for emphasis. "If you're targeting an elf, you've got to spot their factum first. Always made of wood, always on their person. If they're sending a spell your way, that's where it's coming from." Given their tender years and inauspicious origins, Saskia wasn't sure the kids would have ever even seen an elf up close, let alone understand the workings of the pointy ear's power. Seeing as that's a bloody big disadvantage, you've got one hope. Get in and get out before they know they've been had, and certainly before they get a chance to cast at you. Derry bit his lip, eyes flicking between the various elves in the square. They were easy to locate, even without the tapered tops of their ears. Tall and elegant, with an extravagant dress sense. Though the elves here weren't quite fancy enough to have their own dragon bodyguards like some of the nobles, that didn't stop them from walking around as if they owned the place. Saskia couldn't deny that part of the temptation to target an elf wasn't just the bigger prize. It was the satisfaction of knowing you'd wiped that smug look off their face for just a moment. "I'm not gonna ask you to target an elf today," Saskia said, and Derry's sigh of relief was audible. "But you've gotta pick your own mark." "Her," Derry said eventually, nodding at an old woman with a cane, hobbling along the gutter as she looked for somewhere safe to cross the street. Not ideal, Saskia thought, but that was the point of having lessons. "Okay, go for it. And remember, pincher movement." She pinched her thumb and index finger together like a crab, performing the wallet-lifting technique she'd taught them back at guild headquarters. Derry scampered across the road, dodging carts and carriages, and sidled up to the old woman, hovering at her elbow.
"He's hesitating,"
Clemmy said, sounding disapproving. Even from their position, they could see how Derry kept lifting his hand. Then the woman would shift in her spot, and he'd lose his nerve. It was only a matter of time before she spotted Derry over her shoulder. They exchanged a few words before she whacked him round the ankles with her cane. Derry managed to leap to one side to avoid another swing and scurried away, doubling back to their corner once the woman had moved on. She ignored Derry's red face and forged ahead with her lesson. "You did about 8 things wrong there. You're redeemed if you can name one." "I picked a bad mark," Derry said, rejected. "It happens. Old people don't tend to be good targets. They usually don't carry a lot of coin on them. It's too heavy, and they feel too vulnerable." "She didn't seem very vulnerable to me," Derry complained, rubbing his ankle. "This is the city. You think these old folks have survived here this long without being tough? What's another mistake?"
"He waited too long,"
Kieran said. "You let your nerves get the best of you," Saskia agreed. "You've got to take those jitters and channel them. Use them to move fast and ignore your doubts. It's called a con for a reason." Saskia looked between the boys expectantly, but their faces were blank.
"Because confidence is the key,"
Clemmy answered for them, repeating one of Grecius's favored mottos. Saskia gave her a genuine smile. "Exactly." Without another word, Saskia spun on her heel and slipped between the streams of people, making a beeline for the man she'd spotted out of the corner of her eye 10 minutes ago. His long maroon coat brushed the filthy cobblestones, and his pack was so overladen it threatened to unbalance him as he leaned over a stall of tourist junk. He couldn't have been more obviously from out of town if he'd stuck a coach ticket from Weirshane on his forehead. No one in Baskin wore that shade of red, except for the palace guards. Saskia suppressed a shiver at the thought of them. Her nerves jumped beneath her skin, but she relished the sensation. It made her feel alive. She strolled past the stall, as if fascinated by the wares of the milliner next door. Then it took just a quick jab of an elbow. She didn't even have to look back. The clatter of several items tumbling from the tabletop told her she'd been successful in creating a distraction. "Oh, gracious," came the traveler's apologetic tones. "I'm so sorry." The stall owner grunted impatiently, and the traveler bent down to help gather together the spilled souvenir medallions and tacky trinkets. Saskia barely paused as her hand fell to the side, then moved to his. The purse was off his belt and in her pocket before she'd even passed the display of hats. She suppressed a smug feeling at the odd expressions of her 3 protégés when she returned. "Don't hesitate. Don't overthink. Don't get caught," she said in her best stern teacher voice, or what she imagined a teacher would sound like, seeing as Saskia had never been to school. She moved them on to Sibyllis Square, wanting to let their trail of theft run cold to avoid getting the watchers on their backs. The City Watch were the lowest form of life in Baskin, humans who did the elves' dirty work, policing their own kind for a few coins from their pointy-eared masters. The square was an obvious choice of location for easy marks. Central, sprawling, and dominated by a hulking statue of Emperor Rian III, people congregated there like flies on manure. Saskia stopped the kids at the edge of the square, taking in the scene. "Got tired of picking scraps off beggars in the Muse, girl?" Saskia rolled her eyes and turned to see the pile of chipped teeth and scraggly hair that had spoken. A fellow thief she'd had a few unpleasant run-ins with before. "You should try spending some time there, Loris. Those beggars could probably give you some bathing tips." The chipped teeth disappeared, hidden by a scowl. "This is my turf, Gutlicker. You and your brats can get lost." She ignored the nasty name and stared hard at the side of his face, as if confused. "Last time I checked, you weren't no pointy ears, Loris, and you don't own this square." "Try to cross me, girl, and I'll leave your innards out for the sun to dry." His crusty fingernails drifted over the hilt of a dagger at his waistband. Saskia snorted, sure of 2 things. First, Loris was all bark and no bite. The man was too lazy to actually resort to violence. Secondly, she could absolutely take him in a knife fight. She'd been unprepared once, years ago, which had earned her a nasty scar on her arm. But after that, she'd bullied Grecius into teaching her the right way around a blade. She'd not been bested since. Clemmy tugged at her sleeve, face pale.
"Maybe we should go, Sass."
She wasn't to know that Loris posed no real threat. Saskia guessed that part of the way Clemmy survived for so long on the streets by herself was that she smelled trouble from a mile away. Looking into Loris's beetle eyes, Saskia realized that perhaps there was something for the kids to learn here. She shrugged and stepped back from the standoff, gesturing to the square. "She's all yours." Loris merely spat at Saskia's feet and sauntered away. "What are you doing?" asked Derry with a groan. "We've as much claim here as that greasy mudsucker." "Don't I know it," Saskia said, "but that greasy mudslicker is gonna teach you something. Loris has been in the Watcher's clinks more times than you can count. His eyes are too big for his grasping little fingers. Confidence is key, but dumb ambition will just get you locked up." She pointed to a lustrous litter moving slowly across the square, a structure shrouded in bolts of velvet and silk so that the wealthy elves being carried inside were but glamorous silhouettes. It was a ridiculous target, as conspicuous as one could get, and ringed with human servants. But one of the litter's occupants was idly dangling their hand over the side, their exposed wrist decorated by a bracelet studded with sparkling gems. "He's not going to try taking that, is he?" Derry hissed in disbelief. Saskia was pleased he'd immediately seen the shape of Loris's plan and the foolishness of it. "Watch and learn," Saskia murmured. Loris shuffled closer to the litter, which wasn't hard considering it was moving at a glacial pace. The humans carrying it looked exhausted, and throngs of people pressed in around them, leaving a wide window of opportunity. But Loris's sleight of hand was shoddy. It always had been. His fingers closed round the bracelet, but he fumbled the clasp release, resulting in a few seconds tug-of-war between him and the elf. The owner of the arm was caught by surprise. Otherwise, Saskia knew she'd have been more than strong enough to break his grip, his whole hand even. Instead, Loris gave another yank, and the bracelet was off, though not without detection. "Thief!" The shriek cut through the roar of the square's activity, the elf's cry like shattering crystal. Several pairs of eyes quickly fell on Loris, who was only bringing more attention to himself as he scrambled away from the litter. Kieran leaned in to Saskia.
"Should we help him, Sass? Cause a distraction or something?"
And put ourselves in the spotlight? Why would we do something as harebrained as that? Saskia had visions of watchers carting the snub-nosed boy off in cuffs and reflexively put a hand on his shoulder in case he got a sudden urge to run out into the commotion. It was one thing to protect one of their own, another to risk their freedom because Loris was trying to show off and got caught. "Stop him!" the elf directed to a woman walking at the back of the litter, tucked too close behind it for Saskia to have noticed her before. For a fleeting moment, that Saskia would feel stupid for later, Saskia thought the order strange. What good was one's servant going to be? Then the woman disappeared. It happened, like always, in a matter of seconds. So fast that all Saskia caught was an explosion of talons and scales, like the space the woman stood in a moment before had rearranged itself, twisting up and then unfurling into a hulking reptilian form of rippling muscle and taut, leathery wings. But it was the eyes that Saskia always noticed first. Great golden orbs she couldn't look away from. They drove a frosty shard of fear through her core, provoking dark memories of fire and death. The dragon, having abandoned its human disguise, loped forwards. People in the square parted, shoals of fish scattering before a shark as she fixed her lethal gaze on Loris. To his credit, he was fast, dashing for the edge of the square. Perhaps he thought he could lose her away from this open space, but he was a long way from the narrow streets of human neighborhoods like the Mews. Baskin had once belonged to dragons, was built for them, and so the avenues near the Hask stretched wide and broad. The dragon, her vermilion tail swishing behind her, leapt after him. Loris veered right and, clever, Saskia thought, her heart in her throat, darted for the storm drain built into the foot of an imposing brick building lining one side of the square. The bars were set wide, and it probably led straight to the Hask. If he could swim, it was a decent chance at a clean getaway. But the dragon could predict what he was planning as well as Saskia could. Her elven mistress still screeching for justice, the dragon opened her jaws to emit a roar that vibrated the bones in Saskia's chest. Like a roiling furnace, a wave of flames billowed from the beast's mouth, consuming the air between her and Loris, engulfing his flailing body as he dove for the drain grate. Saskia seized Derry and Kieran and spun them around, pulling their faces in towards her. She didn't have a spare hand for Clemmy. "Close your eyes," she barked, and the girl was smart enough to follow orders. But Saskia couldn't block out the noise. Loris released a high-pitched keen, somewhere between a scream and groan, that was cut off in a horrifying gargle. Saskia tried to look away herself, but even when she turned her gaze to the sky, she couldn't unsee the awful sight of charring flesh. When he fell silent and the flames ran out of skin to burn, the dragon stalked forward, dipping her huge red snout to what remained of Loris's still outstretched arm, draped along the ground. Delicately, almost like she was picking a flower, the dragon hooked the bracelet between her teeth. each canine the length of Saskia's palm. The square was as silent as the grave it had so quickly become. Yes, retribution came fast to foolish humans in the big city, but rarely was the hand of justice so brutal. That's what happened when you let dragons off the leash, Saskia thought grimly. The reptile in question twitched the bracelet into the air where it spun, once, twice, then landed in the open hand of the woman who'd had wings and a tail seconds ago. She'd shifted mid-stride, a seemingly innocuous lady, if you weren't close enough to see her telltale eyes, or experienced enough to recognize the tunic of a dragon guard. She polished the bracelet against the cloth of her uniform before reaching the litter and extending it to her mistress's outstretched hand. Not many elves had access to personal dragon security. This elf must have been close to the Empress. Turning to return to her position behind the litter, the dragon's face was astonishingly neutral. Just another day at her job, Saskia thought bitterly. Then the litter was moving again, out of the square and towards the Imperial Palace. It was like a spell had broken, and Saskia's senses were once again filled with the sights and sounds of people getting on with their lives. Only one thing had changed. A corner of the square everyone now avoided, where a charred form lay crumpled on the cobblestones. Something wriggled in Saskia's hand. Kieran, shifting his shoulders. She released the two boys she hadn't realized she was still gripping tight. She felt numb, as if it was her nerve endings that had been singed off by the dragon fire.
There wasn't anything we could have done, was there?
Clemmie's voice quavered with doubt. No, she said definitively, and the hardness in her own voice helped Saskia convince herself. She ushered the kids away from the square, from the long shadow of the statue, wishing she could put Loris's fate behind her as easily. They moved through the city in silence until they were in sight of the grubby, narrow alleys of the Mews once more. Saskia tried not to give in to her rising sense of relief. They were far from any neighborhood the elves would be caught dead in now, and the cramped passageways were as effective an anti-dragon device as she could get. Still, nowhere was truly safe, not for humans. She turned to face the kids, each one staring expectantly up at her. "You listen to me, okay?" She made eye contact with each of them, driving home her words. "The world isn't gonna give you a thing you don't take or scheme up for yourself. But if you slip up, it'll make sure you don't see another day. That's why you can't stick your neck out for people. We keep to ourselves, mind our own business, and that's how we get by. Understand? You don't owe anyone anything, 'cause they sure as seas aren't gonna look out for you." 3 sets of heads nodded solemnly. She heard the gruff, blunt tones of their guild leader echoing in her ears as she spoke. Grecius had given Saskia this same speech when she was Kieran's age, when she'd stumbled half-starved into his path a few months after running away from the city orphanage. As the years went on and the guild recruits got more wide-eyed, she'd begun to think that 8 might have been too young to hear it. But today was a reminder that it was never too early to learn this lesson. Not if you wanted to live to see puberty. The familiar, dank musk of the Mews beckoned, and she decided that there'd been enough teaching today. But Kieran had another question.
"What about us, though?" he asked. "What about the guild?"
He glanced at Clemmie and Derry.
"Aren't we supposed to look out for each other?"
Saskia tried to soften her expression, bending to wipe a smear of jam off his face. "That's different. All of us have chosen to be kin, right? That means we're in this together." She looked between the 3 of them, each a fighter in their own way, but they couldn't win this battle alone. They would need to remember to rely on each other if they were going to survive. "I'll always have your backs, and you'll have mine. Deal?" They took it in turns to shake her hand, but Saskia's mind was elsewhere, picturing a different set of fingers, blackened and smoking, clutching the glinting elven bracelet they'd burned for.